Twyliah lived at home, 3812 Clinton Avenue South, with her mom and dad and with her brother George and sisters Linda and Dinah. And I had an apartment over by the university. My address was 432 4th Street, Southeast. And 4th Street has a musical importance because that 4th Street goes right through Dinkytown, the business district adjacent to the University of Minnesota. And 4th Street was the reason why Bob Dylan wrote a song called Positively 4th Street. But what I had was a studio apartment on the second floor overlooking 4th Street. And I could walk from there to the campus. And Twyliah was coming over fairly frequently and staying with me in my apartment. And so things were going along pretty well between the two of us. I believe she was working at Honeywell at the time, and I was working at Greenbelt Brewery. I had a job at night working at the brewery, and then I had a weekend job as a copy boy at the Minneapolis Star and Tribune. And we were deciding at that point that we wanted to get married, and we were starting to look around for an apartment and starting to acquire some of the things we needed, furnishings and kitchenware and all that sort of thing. And one night when I was at the brewery, I got a call from Twyliah's cousin, Punkin, who was able to reach me at the brewery with an emergency call, and she said that I needed to get to Hennepin County General Hospital as quickly as possible, that Twyliah had threatened to commit suicide, and she was being held in the psychiatric ward. So I took off work and drove down as quickly as I could to the hospital, and I found that she was being restrained at the time, and the doctors told me that it was true that she had threatened to commit suicide, although she hadn't really done any damage, hadn't taken any pills or started cutting on her wrists or anything. But she was in a very panicky state, and she was. They were giving her some kinds of sedatives to calm her down. As I began to talk to her doctors at the hospital, what I learned was that she had had a real episode of what was then called manic depression, what's called bipolar syndrome today, and that they didn't really know what to do about that, but except to keep her in a place where she couldn't hurt herself. So they kept her in the psychiatric ward for a couple of weeks. What I learned from the doctors that I didn't know was that Twyliah's home situation was very dysfunctional, that I knew that her mother and father didn't speak to one another except to exchange notes to one another on the kitchen table. And what I knew was that Twyliah was kind of the manager of the house. She did the shopping, and she made sure that the other kids did the housework. Her mother had a job, and her father had a job, and they together supported financially the house, bought the groceries and made the house payments and paid the bills and so forth. But it was, in a social sense, a very dysfunctional family. And her brother George was already, having problems with alcohol, and her sister Linda was a kind of a recluse who had an older gentleman as a friend named Mr. McInnes, and Linda didn't seem to have any other boyfriends. I don't know what her relationship truly was with Mr. McInnes. But Dinah was, at the time, leading a pretty wild life and hanging around with some pretty unsavory characters, one of whom was a noted pimp and what was called a snitch, a guy that was an informant for the police. And all in all, the members of the family were really struggling. Twyliah was the straight A student, and when we found out she was pregnant, it was kind of a blow to her self-esteem, I think. But we had planned on getting married, and we had planned on getting an apartment, and so things seemed like they were going to work out until she had this episode of manic depression. And the doctors at the time told me that it would be foolhardy for the two of us to think about marriage until they were able to get a handle on what was bothering her. And her parents and my parents all advised the same, that we ought to hold off and just let her go ahead and have the baby and do the best we could to get her back on her feet and get her problems under control. So that's what we decided to do. She was eventually released from the hospital, and she went to live with her Aunt Polly for a couple of months. And I recall going over to visit her almost every day when I could, in between classes and work. And I recall her some days being just absolutely bubbly and in great spirits, and then other days she would sit on a pillow in the middle of the living room and just rock back and forth and cry uncontrollably and not be able to talk. And it was a very, very difficult time for both of us. But our son David was born on August 15th, 1967, and he was healthy, and we both agreed that we would be the best parents we could, and we would try to see if she could reach a point of recovery where we could go ahead and get married. And eventually it became clear that her mental state was not such, an emotional state was such that marriage would make any sense at all. So we just tried to provide the best care we could for him. And what that meant was us sharing parenting duties as much as we could, and we did. And she continued to live with her aunt for quite a while. And then I think she moved back with her mother and father for a while, and the two of us actually lived together in my small apartment by the university for a while. So the situation was quite unsettled. And eventually we ended up splitting up, and she ended up going back out with a guy that she had dated before we met, a guy named Renee Pulley, and they were together for a little while, and then she met a couple of other guys along the way and shared an apartment with them and had her own apartment for a while. So we were going through a couple years of fairly difficult times, and then finally I was in danger of being drafted, and I will continue with the next chapter to describe what happened with the draft.